At 10:47 p.m., 12 cardinals received the same 8-word message. His Holiness wishes to see you tonight. No agenda, no explanation. By midnight, they were standing inside a dim Vatican chamber, facing Pope Leo, a sealed red folder, and a black notebook containing 12 handwritten names. What allegedly happened next would expose a hidden struggle for power, and prove that the Pope's silence had never meant weakness. If we examine the account of that extraordinary night closely, one fact immediately stands out. Pope Leo had no intention of waiting for sunrise. Shortly before midnight in Rome, 12 cardinals received the same 8-word summons. His Holiness wishes to see you tonight. There was no explanation, no written agenda, and apparently no opportunity for the usual Vatican consultations that might dilute a difficult message before it reached its destination. The first phones reportedly rang at precisely 10:47 p.m. Each man was contacted separately, and none was told who else had been called. By 11:30, all 12 were moving through the Apostolic Palace beneath the watchful silence of its ancient corridors. They did not question the Swiss guard or exchange careless remarks. Men formed inside the Roman Curia understand that, on certain nights, even an innocent question can reveal more than an answer. They were not taken to the papal library, where uncomfortable disputes are often wrapped in diplomatic language. Instead, they entered a rarely used side chamber. A single dim light hung above a long table. 12 chairs had been arranged along one side. At the far end stood one empty seat. There were no secretaries, cameras, legal advisors, or trusted aides present to reinterpret what would be spoken. The human tension was visible before a word was uttered. One cardinal repeatedly touched the cross resting on his chest. Another stared at the polished marble, as though refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The oldest remained almost unnaturally still. They did not know the precise reason for the summons, but each understood the same unsettling truth. A pope does not gather 12 senior churchmen near midnight merely to request friendly advice. Then the door opened. Leo entered without an entourage, carrying a red folder beneath one arm and a small notebook bound in black leather. He placed them carefully on the table, not with anger, but with the unsettling calm of a man whose decisions had already been made. The cardinals studied the folder, then the notebook, and finally the Pope himself. Leo looked at every face in turn. 12 men, 12 careers, and 12 lives shaped by the complex machinery of the Roman Curia. For the public, the previous week had appeared perfectly ordinary. Leo had greeted pilgrims, received official visitors, smiled before cameras, and blessed children in St. Peter's Square. Behind the palace doors, however, a far more serious process had reportedly been underway. Each page inside the red folder had been reviewed. Signatures had been compared, dates reconstructed, and authorizations checked against internal records. The men in that room did not yet realize that Leo had received the material 10 days earlier. They apparently believed his silence represented hesitation, fatigue, or uncertainty. In reality, the narrative suggests something very different. By the time his aircraft returned to Rome, he already understood what had taken place during his absence. His quietness was not surrender. It was preparation, measured, patient, and methodical. Now that preparation had ended, the red folder lay beside the black notebook as Leo rested his hand near the documents. Whatever had brought the cardinals together was no longer being treated as gossip, suspicion, or a private dispute between competing Vatican factions. The information had allegedly been documented and independently checked. More disturbingly for those present, every one of their names appeared somewhere within those pages. To understand how the Church reached this moment, we must return 10 days earlier, to April 23, 2026. Pope Leo had just completed an exhausting 11-day apostolic journey through Algeria, Cameroon, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea. To television audiences, it looked like a familiar papal mission. Immense crowds, formal addresses, solemn liturgies, and carefully organized encounters. Yet those closest to Leo reportedly noticed something different in him before the plane landed. During the journey, he had prayed inside humble chapels, visited a prison beneath relentless rain, and encountered communities whose faith survived without prestige or political influence. In Cameroon, children were said to have walked 4 hours simply to receive his blessing. Such encounters did not merely exhaust him. They sharpened his awareness of the distance between a living church among the poor and the hidden rivalries of Rome. That contrast made the discovery awaiting him aboard the return flight even more painful. During the final stage of the journey, an unidentified person discreetly left a red folder on the Pope's private desk. No messenger was announced. No sender's name appeared on the cover. There was only a restrained label for confidential internal use. When Leo opened the folder above the Mediterranean, his expression reportedly changed. Inside were 23 pages of dates, approvals, signatures, and carefully phrased administrative language, the kind of language designed to appear harmless to anyone unfamiliar with ecclesiastical power. But Leo understood how authority could be obstructed without anyone openly declaring rebellion. The file identified 12 names. According to the account, they were not included by coincidence. They belonged to the same 12 cardinals who would later receive the midnight summons. By the time the papal aircraft touched down in Rome, Leo had already closed the report. There was no public explosion, no immediate accusation, and no dramatic confrontation on the runway. He carried the folder back into the Vatican and maintained his normal schedule. Yet behind that composed exterior, a silent response was beginning to take shape. What the documents allegedly described went far beyond a simple administrative disagreement. During the 11 days Leo spent in Africa, a small but influential circle within the Roman Curia had worked to obstruct 3 defining reforms of his pontificate. There had been no public revolt, no inflammatory declaration, and no visible act of defiance. The resistance was quieter and therefore more difficult to expose. Amendments were inserted, deadlines were extended, technical objections appeared at decisive moments, bureaucratic delays were presented as prudence, while decisions already approved by the Pope were gradually weakened. To an ordinary observer, the Vatican seemed calm. But beneath that calm, the account portrays a coordinated effort to reduce papal authority through paperwork rather than confrontation. And that may have been the conspirators' greatest miscalculation. They believed Leo's absence gave them time. They believed his public serenity meant he had noticed nothing. But when those 12 cardinals finally stood before the red folder, they began to understand that the Pope had not returned from Africa uninformed. He had returned with their names. The first reform passed sought to impose absolute financial transparency through external audits led by independent laypeople free from personal favors, career debts, or old friendships within the Vatican walls. For the more traditional sectors of the Curia, this external oversight posed a serious threat. It meant secret accounts would come to light, questionable contracts would be traced, and decisions protected by decades of silence would be exposed to independent observers. The second affected reform was structural. The Supreme Pontiff planned to decentralize the power of the Roman dicasteries, granting greater autonomy to bishoprics located outside Europe. He had expressed this clearly during his African tour. Rome cannot continue governing with its back turned to a church that is no longer merely European. While the Pope was traveling, this initiative was suffocated with technicalities and amendments. The third reform was the most delicate. As it struck directly at wounds the institution could no longer hide. Leo demanded a strict accountability protocol for bishops who covered up abuse, eliminating discreet transfers, quiet retirements, and official opacity. His plan required transparent processes, publicly accessible records, and accountable individuals identified by name and surname. For those prelates accustomed to shielding themselves behind bureaucratic formalities, this change threatened the very foundations of their corporate protection network. While Pope Leo was praying beside prisoners in Africa, 3 central reforms of his pontificate were being quietly weakened in Rome. No public rebellion was necessary. One carefully timed signature, a vague clause inserted at the final moment, and the calculated postponement of a curial memorandum were enough to stop the decrees without openly rejecting papal authority. By the time Leo finished reading the report over the Mediterranean, the conclusion was deeply disturbing. His program had not been challenged through honest debate. It had been restrained through technical language, patient obstruction, and professional bureaucracy. Yet those responsible made one serious error. They assumed that the Pope's physical absence gave them freedom to act without consequence. They never imagined that the same administrative loopholes meant to conceal their actions could later become evidence against them. After returning to Rome, the Holy Father remained publicly silent for 7 days. He continued presiding over general audiences and blessing the faithful in St. Peter's Square. On April 27th, he welcomed the Archbishop of Canterbury, Sarah Mullally, to the Apostolic Palace. Together, they prayed in the Chapel of Urban and spoke of Christ's disarmed peace. To viewers watching the television images, the Vatican appeared calm, orderly, and untouched by internal conflict. Behind those walls, however, the Red Folder was already determining what would happen next. Rather than confront the cardinals immediately, Leo began verifying every claim in private. He invited a small circle of trusted people into his office, one at a time, without assistants or witnesses. The first was the head of the Central Office of Statistics. Then came a lay collaborator whom Leo had known during his years in Peru, followed by the independent auditors appointed the previous summer. The final visitor was the prefect of the Dicastery for Communication. Each person entered alone and departed separately. They were reportedly required to keep the conversations confidential. The Pope was not interested in rumors, emotional accusations, or a convenient explanation. He wanted the dates confirmed, the signatures authenticated, and the chain of authorization reconstructed before making any move. By the morning of April 30th, the folder had changed in significance. It was no longer a collection of suspicious documents. Every relevant email, signature, and date had been compared against internal records. Leo reportedly became convinced that the obstruction of his reforms could not be dismissed as ordinary Vatican delay. The pattern appeared organized. The men connected to those pages had acted as though distance would protect them. What they failed to understand was that the Pope's silence was not passivity. It was more dangerous to their position than an immediate outburst would have been. Had Leo reacted upon landing, those involved might have coordinated their defense. Had he summoned them during the first hours, they could have agreed upon a common explanation and blamed the delays on administrative confusion. Instead, he waited until the documents could speak more clearly than any accusation. At dawn, the Pope called a retired official to his private office. The elderly man had served for decades inside the Roman Curia and expected a pastoral conversation, perhaps a routine consultation about earlier pontificates. He had no reason to anticipate what Leo placed before him. 3 sheets of paper were laid across the desk. "Have you seen this pattern before?" the Pope asked. The retired official read without speaking. His eyes moved slowly across the signatures, dates, amendments, and carefully constructed procedures. He recognized not simply a series of decisions, but the architecture of an institution protecting itself. When he finally looked up, his answer carried the fatigue of long experience. "Yes, Holy Father, many times, under 3 different pontificates. They always follow the same method. They wait until the Pope is tired, absent, or distracted, and then they move." Leo allowed him to finish before asking how the previous popes had responded. According to the account, the old official lowered his gaze and answered with painful honesty, "They did not. That is why they became so exhausted." There was no dramatic accusation in those words, yet they struck at the heart of the matter. The red folder no longer appeared to describe an isolated dispute. It suggested a method refined across years. Delay the decision, exhaust the leader, hide responsibility among offices, and wait until resistance loses its strength. Leo thanked the man and remained alone at his desk. A decision was forming. He would not answer delay with more delay, nor give those named in the documents enough time to create a shared version of events. Before confronting them, he would ensure that every fact had been secured. That afternoon, the Pope walked alone through the Vatican gardens for almost an hour. A close aide later described it as the only occasion on which he appeared visibly furious. There was no shouting and no uncontrolled gesture. His anger was colder than that, contained, disciplined, and increasingly transformed into resolve. When darkness settled over Rome, the silence finally ended. The calls went out, summoning 12 cardinals who still believed their actions remained hidden. Pope Leo was already waiting in a secluded room with the verified documents. The first cardinal arrived at 11:01 p.m., leaving his quarters with a leather folder, even though he had not been asked to bring anything. 3 minutes later, a second man stepped out of a black car. The third and fourth entered together, but exchanged no words, not even inside the elevator. By 11:35 p.m., all 12 had crossed into the Apostolic Palace. A long table awaited them beneath a dim light. 12 chairs stood in place. There were no advisors, secretaries, cameras, or witnesses present to soften the confrontation. The men had arrived separately, but they now shared the same uneasy realization. Whatever they believed had remained buried inside the machinery of Rome was about to be placed directly before them. When Leo entered, holding the red folder and a black leather notebook, none of those present doubted his purpose. They were not mere symbols. They were instruments of judgment. The pontiff observed each person present at a measured pace, causing the tension of the silence to become deeply personal. They were 12 faces, 12 names of highly influential men whose careers now hung by a thread because of the documents resting on the table. Leo did not resort to verbal reproaches or justify the emergency summons. With deliberation, he opened the red folder, pulled out a page, and held it in plain view for everyone to read the date stamped at the top, April 16th. No one dared to say a word. It was an internal directive postponing the lay financial audit, one of the most crucial reforms of his pontificate, by 90 days, drafted in flawless bureaucratic tone. It did not look like rebellion. It presented itself under the harmless guise of a mere administrative procedure, and that was precisely where its danger lay. At the bottom of the page were 4 signatures whose authors were in the room. The Pope tilted the paper so they could behold the signatures. 3 of you signed this, he stated in an icy tone, and 1 of you drafted it. The words echoed through the room without any need to raise his voice. After a calculated pause, he continued, I did not sign this document. No one consulted me or informed me about it, yet you delayed a crucial reform by 3 months while I was preaching to children in Cameroon. None of the cardinals replied. Some stared fixedly at the page, others looked at the floor, and one observed the black leather notebook with visible terror, sensing that this object posed a greater danger than the document itself. Leo had brought both items with a clear intent. The red folder contained the incriminatory evidence, and the black notebook held the decisions already made. The Pope placed the memorandum on the table without closing the folder. That first paper had already served its purpose, demonstrating that he was not acting on rumors or mere suspicions. He had the key dates, the language used, the stamped signatures, and the culprits right in front of him. The pontiff looked up and declared with glacial composure, This is only the first document. There are 8 others left to examine. Without any haste, Leo extracted the second page, then the third and the fourth. Each page unveiled a decision made behind his back during the 11 days he spent on the African continent. An office had been reorganized, a finance supervisor dismissed, and a contract he had personally suspended was reopened. Even a papal investigation was postponed, and a bishop under suspicion received authorization to travel despite being forbidden from leaving his diocese. At first glance, the documents appeared harmless. Routine memoranda, internal adjustments, and procedural decisions written in the neutral language of administration. Yet, when examined together, they revealed something far more serious. A deliberate pattern designed to obstruct papal authority without ever appearing openly rebellious. As Leo turned each page, the silence grew heavier. These were not rumors whispered in Vatican corridors. The file contained dates, official signatures, approvals, and carefully constructed phrases written by men who understood how to bury a papal directive beneath bureaucracy. The Pope had no reason to shout. The documents were already speaking more forcefully than anger could. By the 8th memorandum, Cardinal Decano, nearly 80, began to tremble. When Leo reached the 9th, another cardinal quietly collapsed into tears beneath the dim light. His shoulders shook, but he said nothing. No one moved to console him. No one offered a defense or asked the Pope to stop. The unity that had appeared so secure inside the documents disappeared the moment those men faced the consequences together. Leo returned the final page to the red folder and placed his hand firmly upon it. Only then did the cardinals seem to understand the full weight before them. 23 pages, documenting 11 days of decisions made behind the Pope's back. These were not isolated mistakes or careless signatures. The pattern was too precise. 11 days, Leo said quietly. While I was in Africa, 11 days and 23 pages of damage. His voice remained controlled. I know who began it, who supported it, who signed without reading, and who processed every document. I know who remained silent, and who instructed others to do the same. The temperature in the room seemed to fall, yet Leo's tone remained calm. I did not summon you to hear confessions, collect excuses, or humiliate anyone publicly, he continued. I summoned you because the truth must be complete. For the first time that night, the Pope sat down. Until then, he had remained standing above the evidence. The simple gesture changed the room. Now he faced them directly, his fingers interlocked upon the wooden table. The Church will not be governed from the shadows, he said slowly in Italian. Not while I am here, not after I am gone, and not under any future pontificate. Then he looked toward Cardinal Decano. You knew Francis, you worked beside him, you watched him struggle to reform this institution, and you saw how resistance inside these walls exhausted him year after year, until even his voice carried the burden. Leo allowed the words to settle before adding the sentence no one expected. I am not Francis, and I will not be exhausted in the same way. No one answered. For perhaps the first time in their powerful careers, the 12 cardinals had no prepared argument and no common strategy. Leo was not debating administrative details. He was confronting a system of resistance. You mistook my silence for blindness, he said. You believed calmness meant acceptance. You were wrong. Then came the declaration that would later be repeated in whispers throughout the palace. The Church will no longer hide behind silence, bureaucracy, or cardinal red. Truth is not negotiable. Reform is not optional. Obedience to the See of Peter cannot depend on convenience. The force of his words came precisely from the absence of theatrics. Leo never struck the table or raised his voice. Instead, he reached for the black leather notebook, opened it to a marked page, and revealed 12 handwritten names. Beside each was a decision. Without speaking, he turned the notebook toward them. The men read their futures in silence. Some saw warning. Others saw review or immediate dismissal. Only one name carried the word trust. Yet even that cardinal showed no relief. He looked stunned, as though the Pope had separated him from the group without needing to accuse anyone aloud. When Leo closed the notebook, the soft sound seemed to echo across the chamber. The decision had already been made. This was no longer a discussion of procedure, but a controlled administrative judgment. Before they could fully absorb what they had read, Leo gave his final instruction. Each of you will receive written notice before the end of the week. Some will remain, some will be reassigned, and others will be asked to retire. He paused and looked around the table. No one will speak of this meeting. The pontiff's tone did not rise at all. Instead, it became flatter, colder, and more calculated. If a single line of what transpired in this room reaches the press, you will be reassigned immediately, he warned without blinking. Without exceptions, without trials, and without the possibility of appeal within the very hour that said article is published. No one dared to make the slightest movement. The threat lacked dramatic flair, but its effectiveness was absolute. It left no room for escape, no safe channels to betray one another, nor to divert one's own fear toward another's scandal. With unyielding firmness, Leo declared, "I do not negotiate with leaks." Immediately afterward, he lifted the red folder. "Backup copies exist in safekeeping," the Pope continued, "and they will be published in full if anything happens to me or to this document." At that instant, the collective panic in the room transformed. The cardinals knew the pontiff was deeply outraged, but they never imagined he would have shielded himself against any subsequent resistance, with the same coldness with which he planned the confrontation itself. An unsettling doubt began to take root in their minds. How long had he been aware of everything? Days? Weeks? Did he know before his trip to Africa? Had he allowed them to conspire in his absence, only to return with all the evidence locked away in that folder? No one dared to pose a question. The meeting had passed the point of empty words. Leo stood up once again and began to slowly circle the stately table. He walked alongside the prelates without touching them, without leaning toward them, maintaining a frigid distance. Upon reaching the third chair from the end, he stopped dead in his tracks and placed his hand on the backrest. "You drafted the memorandum of April 16th, he stated, addressing the cardinal occupying the seat. "You designed the exact wording, handed it to the others, and justified the delay, convincing two brothers that it was the most sensible course. I possess the metadata of the files, the draft history, the crossed emails, and the statement of a key witness," the pontiff declared with a voice of steel. "There is no possible way out of this labyrinth other than complete honesty." The cardinal, broken by the overwhelming evidence, lowered his head and admitted in a thread of a voice, "It was me." "Why?" the Pope inquired immediately. The answer came with near agonizing slowness. "We believed the reforms were moving too fast, that you did not yet understand the inner workings of the institution, and that the Church needed to be protected from sudden changes." Leo nodded with sober coldness. After a moment, Leo's voice regained its characteristic sharpness. "The Church may require protection, and I acknowledge that certain changes carry risks, for I do not pretend to be infallible in administrative management. However, our institution will never need protection from accountability, nor from the light of truth, nor from God's people, knowing how their offerings are used or how their suffering is managed." The Pope paused dramatically before landing the ultimate blow. "You did not protect the Church, you protected yourself." The prelate kept a sepulchral silence, his face pale and distraught. The pontiff returned slowly to his chair. If we analyze the sequence of events, this was the precise moment the scale tipped definitively. The men seated at the table had already seen the irrefutable evidence, the lists of names, and those devastating categories that shattered their alliance more effectively than any formal indictment. It was then that the Pope began detailing the plan with the coldness of a logistical report. "This is what will happen from now on," he announced. "The financial audit will suffer no delays. Rather, it will be accelerated immediately, without concessions of any kind. The organizational restructuring will be carried out in stages, but with a strictly binding character. The first 3 departments affected will be made public immediately, and the cardinals directing them will receive official notification just hours before the announcement to the press." With his eyes fixed on the table, Leo delivered the sentence that would eliminate 3 ecclesiastical careers without mitigation. "None of you will remain at the head of those offices when the statement is issued." A dense silence fell. 3 of those present realized instantly that their influence in the Curia had vanished. One of them clenched his fists. The third cardinal stared at the wooden table as if it could reveal an emergency exit. At that exact moment, the Pope executed an unforeseen tactical maneuver. One of those present would be appointed to direct the new Internal Control Office, a secret position whose appointee would be revealed the following morning. The 12 cardinals looked at one another with palpable distrust. They had entered as a monolithic block and would leave as 12 isolated individuals, wondering who had been chosen to monitor the rest. Leo did not speak of punishment or vengeance, only of safeguarding the future of the Church. It was then that he recalled his trip to Africa. He evoked the experiences of mothers who lost their children to violence, of priests who lost their faith after being abandoned for speaking the truth, and of young people who left the church fed up with the hypocrisy of their pastors. Those people, he stated solemnly, deserve better than the palace intrigues you have spun in this room over the last 11 days. After these words, he stood up for the last time, walked toward the exit, and before crossing the threshold, turned firmly. Until you receive my individual instructions, you will continue with your regular duties so as not to raise suspicions. You will smile, celebrate Mass, and receive pilgrims. But you will not call one another, write letters, or meet in private, the Pope commanded. And you will pray a lot. Good night, brothers. He opened the door and departed. For almost 10 minutes after Pope Leo departed, none of the 12 cardinals moved. The man who had wept earlier now covered his face with both hands. Across the table, the author of the April 16th memorandum remained fixed on the empty chair the Pope had just left behind, as though the answer to everything might still be found there. At last, the eldest cardinal rose. He offered no farewell and made no attempt to gather the others. He simply walked into the corridor. One by one, the remaining men followed. Outside, beneath the courtyard lamps, they avoided one another's eyes. No one waited beside another car. No one suggested a private conversation. The alliance that had once operated through signatures, amendments, and quiet agreements had been broken without a public accusation. They left in separate vehicles, returning to separate residences, yet all carried the same burden into a sleepless night. At 1:42 a.m., the auxiliary chamber stood empty. A Swiss guard entered, switched off the light, and locked the heavy door, unaware of the confrontation that had just unfolded inside. The Vatican returned to its familiar nighttime silence, but the balance of power within its walls had already changed. Not long afterward, the creation of a new internal control office was formally announced. The appointment of its director surprised nearly everyone. He was not known as a champion of either the progressive or conservative camps. His reputation rested on something rarer in an institution divided by factions: unquestioned personal integrity. Within 72 hours, the consequences could no longer be concealed. 4 of the 12 cardinals requested early retirement. 2 were reassigned to dioceses far from Rome. 3 received formal reprimands, accompanied by severe limits on their authority. The author of the April 16th memorandum, together with another prelate, was placed under a strict 6-month review. No public trial followed. There was no spectacle in St. Peter's Square, and no dramatic list of accusations released to the press. Yet inside the Roman Curia, everyone understood the meaning of the changes. This was not vengeance. It was a precise dismantling of influence. When we examine the episode carefully, we are reminded that genuine authority does not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it alters the course of history through a signature withdrawn, an office reassigned, or a door quietly closed. Within a single week, the atmosphere in the Vatican had changed. Conversations became shorter. Meetings became more cautious. Men who had once trusted their positions began rereading every memorandum before placing their names beneath it. One veteran cardinal summarized the new reality in a single uneasy sentence: "That man sees far more than we believed." Others began to understand what Leo's silence had truly meant. Some had assumed he was hesitating. Others believed he was simply waiting for the tension to pass. But one witness, speaking almost to himself in a cold corridor, offered the judgment that would remain in Vatican memory. They mistook his silence for absence. That was their greatest error. Several days after the midnight meeting, an assistant entered the Pope's private quarters, carrying the morning report. At first, the room appeared entirely ordinary. The desk was clean, the documents aligned, and the palace outside had resumed its daily rhythm of bells, footsteps, sealed correspondence, and conversations spoken just below a whisper. Then, the assistant noticed the small black leather notebook. It lay open on the desk, the same notebook the 12 cardinals had watched with such fear that night. On an otherwise blank page, Pope Leo had written one sentence in his own hand: "The Church will hide no longer." Beneath it, underlined twice, were 3 more words. Begin again tomorrow. The assistant asked nothing. By then, no explanation was necessary. The lesson of that night was already spreading through Rome. Leo did not wait because he was uncertain. He waited because he was observing. His silence was not an absence of authority, but the discipline of a man preparing to act only when the facts could no longer be denied. Behind the walls of the Vatican, those who had relied on delay, exhaustion, and bureaucratic confusion were beginning to understand that their old methods had lost their power. The red folder had finally been closed. The black notebook, however, remained open, and with it, a new chapter had begun. If this account gave you something worth reflecting upon, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing in the comments where you are watching from. Thank you for remaining with us until the end. May God bless you, protect your family, and grant peace to your heart and home. Until we meet again, remain firm in faith and never fear the light of truth. If this story gave you something to reflect on, please support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for staying with us until the end. May God bless you, protect your family, and grant you peace in your heart and in your home. Until we meet again, remain strong in faith and walk always in the light of truth.